So, good afternoon, everybody. This is the panel of the week, right here on Congress Live. We know that workers are indeed not being treated with the respect that they deserve, with the fundamental rights that mean that they have decent work, with wages that are negotiated through collective bargaining, with indeed even a minimum wage on which workers can live with dignity when you get to the supply chains of the major multinationals. So here on Congress Live, we want to iterate that we know that capital is global, that we know that the very foundations of the quest for capital mean that corporate greed is the modus operandi of these companies, and that means that their workers are exploited through their supply chains. We're also seeing new models, and we're seeing new models with digitalisation that indeed allow workers or allow employers to deny workers employment contracts that hold employers potentially to account. So this is our third vote for the worst boss in the world. The first winner in 2014 was Jeff Bezos, of course at that point CEO of Amazon. In 2018 it was Michael O'Leary, CEO of Ryanair. And this time we have three final candidates. We have indeed got Jeff Bezos again, still owns Amazon, even if he doesn't manage it on a day-to-day basis. But it's a business model that churns through over 500,000 workers in a year. That's not job security. We know that these workers are under surveillance, and warehouse workers suffer serious injuries from overwork and a lack of decent breaks for revival. We also know that anti-union attacks on organisers from the US to Europe and other parts of the world are indeed growing. Then we have got the employer Heppleweight, who sacked 800 workers by video message. Can you imagine? You've got a secure job one day and the next day, indeed, you're sacked because you got a video message from the boss. But in fact, it wasn't that the work went away. They simply were replaced by cheaper labour. So neither the replacement workers nor the workers with the contracts benefited from that attack on workers' rights. Security staff, of course, and I won't steal the thunder of my guests, but they actually went on board, removed crew, and indeed, you've probably guessed by now, it is the CEO of P&O Ferries, who, despite sacking all those workers, indeed posted a profit of $721 million. And then you have our very own Australian CEO, Alan Joyce. Alan Joyce has taken an airline that was once the airline that was most revered and respected around the world for its safety record, its work, the treatment of its workers, its the fundamental rights workers enjoyed. And he actually sacked 1,700 workers, ground staff, during the pandemic. He did that for the fact that while in fact he was taking government money. So there was a saying in local Australian workers' circles that says, you know, when you are delayed at the airport, you are getting joiced. In other words, this man has run the company into the ground and passengers are suffering. But I have with me on stage, before I tell you the winner of the worst boss of the year, Christy Hoffman, who of course is the General Secretary of Uni Global Union, needs no introduction, nor does Stephen Cotton, the General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation, because these two courageous union leaders battle these CEOs every day. And Steve, I'm going to ask you first, what was it like to wake up and find 800 of your members had just been sacked by video message?
Well, thanks Sharon, and welcome everybody. In today's modern technology, the first thing I knew about it was from our union Nautilus, which was the officers' union. I woke up to a text message saying all of P&O's ships have been called to berth, and the challenge then was what's going on, what's happening. There'd been no consultation. I should say P&O Ferries is one of the oldest shipping companies from the UK. It's now owned by DP World, and many of you transport workers, supply chain workers, know throughout the pandemic, all of those workers went to work. And the busiest route, Dover to Calais, has something like 8 crossings a day. And the English Channel can be a very challenging environment. So throughout the pandemic, those ferries operated to the best of their ability. And we thought, in transport, particularly as we got highlights all over the world's media, our seafarers were stuck on ships, our truck drivers kept the world moving, warehouse workers, dockers. The reality is we thought, we might get a fair go now that we've had the opportunity to show the world that transport workers can keep it moving. Not for P&O, not for DP World. They decided that those British crew members, under collective bargaining agreements that have been negotiated over tens of years, they weren't needed anymore. And they just decided, as Sharon mentioned, to sack them by Zoom. All on board those big ferries in an environment and said, pack up your stuff and leave now. Disgraceful behaviour. That was the thanks for all the work that they put in to deliver for our societies. Disgusting. Unacceptable, and frankly, and considered by the UK Parliament, illegal. So not only was it disrespectful, it was illegal. So for all of us in the labour movement and transport that does its best to keep everything moving, we are not prepared to accept that behaviour. And I hope very much that Mr. Hepplethwaite can't sleep at night and has a conscience for the families and those seafarers who were denied their livelihoods. There were captains on board those vessels that have been there for more than 30 years. And there were brand new cadets starting a fresh career. So for us in the ITF, we mobilised. We have 2 unions in that, the RMT and Nautilus. They ran campaigns. We picketed outside Parliament. And we even had a House of Commons parliamentary inquiry into the process. Mr. Hepplethwaite knew it was illegal. He said on live video like this, it was illegal. So what are the consequences for them? Nothing yet. So we call on the confused British government to take action, to enforce the law, to make sure he is accountable, and there is a responsibility, because all of us believe in free collective bargaining. And if you can tear up an agreement, recognise that law, then we have a serious problem in the UK. Sorry, Sharon, I'm getting a bit carried away.
No, I think more than justified, Steve. In fact, I'm going to come back to this because Steve's right. Imagine that you were one of those workers and you and your family thought you had a relatively secure job. You'd actually invested, for many of them, in your own homes or bought a car for your family or any other assets, and suddenly you woke up one morning and all of that was absolutely stripped away. No humanity from this boss, that's for sure. But then, Christy, we know too that when it comes to Amazon, that there are so many workers around the world who are just treated as if they were, in fact, robots themselves. So just give us a flavour of what it's like to be an Amazon worker.
Thanks, and hello everyone, and I know you heard a little bit about Amazon today from Stuart Applebaum, but let me just say two features of Amazon. There's a lot to say, but let me focus on 2 things. And one is that Amazon is anti-union as a matter of corporate principle. I mean, they have announced it recently. Jeff Bezos is no longer the CEO, but the new CEO announced that in a public setting how they just don't want unions anywhere, and so much so that that broke U.S. law because it was considered to be intimidating to employees. And every effort, except for a very few exceptions, and one of which is where the Italian unions were able to win collective bargaining, in every effort, Amazon has done everything possible, breaking the law without regard to breaking the law, similar to P&O. It's like, we know it's illegal, but we don't care, to make sure that workers don't have a shot to have a union, and in the U.S., which is always on the extreme side of union busting. But clearly, so much so that even on your toilet stall at work, vote no. And, meeting those workers that are pushing for a union, you have to say how brave they are to keep pushing, but they will keep pushing. And the one group of workers in the United States that was successful in winning a union election, Amazon challenged the election on the basis that the government was biased in favor of the union. Now, really, what a frivolous objection. But they'll be able to stall out any bargaining, and until such time as there's a completely new workforce in the warehouse. And that brings me to the second point, which is the turnover at Amazon, which is so extremely high because they work workers to the bone and then throw them out. They want no one to stay longer than 3 years maximum. Most people stay far less than a year. But 3 years is like the official policy. You can't get a raise after 3 years because their business model, their model inside the warehouse is driven by algorithmic management, which means complete surveillance of every second. Your body is being assessed and surveilled all the time. And the quotas that they keep imposing on workers, you could never go down from your best day. So, if you manage to hit, a 300 one day, the next day you better hit 300 or you're going to get in trouble. They call it, you're going to get written up. So this idea of pushing people beyond what is sustainable, beyond what is humanly possible, day after day, with the intention that they're going to just chew you up, spit you out. It's considered to be one of the most dangerous warehouse job in the world. And based simply upon the fact that workers are not able to take breaks, are not able sometimes to go to the bathroom. So this is the sort of feature of algorithmic management that drives a lot of the workers to say we need a union, we need a protection on that. Now, people are fighting back. Interestingly, in California, they passed a law aimed at Amazon, which really only mandates breaks. And, you need a law to say you get a break in 2022, honestly? And some people said, well, we already have laws around breaks, but we don't have laws that are specifically aimed at warehouses, and you need breaks, and you can't have inhuman quotas. And it was intended to change this kind of behavior, and maybe it's got a different enforcement mechanism than the other laws, but it's really a health and safety issue as well as a dignity issue, as well as just like you can't break people's backs like that, in the sense of maintaining that type of unbearable quota, and also the sort of automated decision making, the automated quotas, the automated discipline, you just automatically get written up because you didn't hit your quota on Friday, the same what you did on Monday, and so they're going to tailor the expectations to every worker to try to push you. And if you're not at the top of your team, somebody's going to get written up. So it's a very unsustainable business model that brings the technology that they're developing, that is also technology that will be shared across other industries, including some of our industries, where we're seeing the same kind of technology being perfected, so-called perfected by the standards. If your goal is to squeeze as much productivity out of workers as humanly possible, and then used in other settings. So this is the broader kind of institutional issue.
So you can see that not only in, as Christy says, in the warehouse, but if I talk to Steve and other guffs around the Amazon model, then the monopoly power that gives them a kind of gangster power in the marketplace means they buy up other companies or they establish other economic activities like transport. They're buying up fleets of cars or planes or licenses to deliver and of course then out-competing other companies with good jobs in the marketplace, like postal services or, trucking companies and the like. So there's no doubt that these companies have to be defeated, all of them, and that's union business. So before I tell you the winner, I want to actually ask if these are the companies that are trying to change the business model to be able to exploit workers, or in the case of P&O, simply to decide that workers are disposable. Christy, I know that you've been fighting teleperformance as well. So tell us about some of the other companies that are worrying you in the context of a model like this.
Well, Teleperformance is a call center company that nobody's ever heard of, right? Has anyone heard of Teleperformance? Not really. 500,000 employees in 60 countries, many of the most highest risk countries for workers in the world, serving all of the clients of the global north. For example, the tech companies, you've got Apple, you've got Facebook. And so one of the issues, and Teleperformance has also been very anti-union. When you look at the countries where they have large numbers of workers, like let's say Colombia or the Philippines, incredibly hostile to unions. But not only there, in parts of Europe, Poland. I mean, I could name a lot of places. But one of the things that is very stressful to workers at Teleperformance is, again, the algorithmic management, and combining that with remote work, which was introduced during COVID in a big scale way and is likely to stay. So when you're talking about having the nonstop camera in your home and all of that data being collected by the company and processed and owned, some contracts that say the client owns your data, when you're talking about not being responsible for your own internet, and when the internet goes down in the Philippines, you don't get paid, which it does frequently. So let me just come back to this question of this full-time remote work for these call center workers is very challenging from the point of view of freedom of association. How do you even know? You've got 40,000 workers in Colombia, largest private sector employer in the country, and a good chunk, many thousands of those workers are working from their home with full-time surveillance on them and full-time pressure, not only on the quantity, but like the tone of voice, the outcome of the call, like full-time surveillance and arguably for privacy reasons, the workers have a real objection, but when the clients of the phone, this is a company that's in the supply chain of some big clients, have the right to demand this surveillance for their own security. They don't want some of the information that the workers are dealing with to be used or seen, or you can't have anyone else in the room. So these issues are big issues for workers, in addition to the pressure and the low wages and so on. And I think it's just another example of this is the new world of work. When you really look at what are the impacts of algorithmic management, and combining that with isolation and inability to talk to coworkers, you don't even know who your team members are. It creates psychosocial stress that has real health and safety consequences. So I could talk about our campaign a little bit, but you want me to do that now?
Well,
or
let's come back to that,
because
when you look at this model of employment with the huge scope that allows technology to have such an impact on the world of work, breaking down not just traditional employment models, but adding, as Christy said, that level of data intrusion, of erosion of privacy, of incredible surveillance about what you are doing in terms of time on task, or how much break you take, or whether you're able to go to the bathroom. I mean, these things are incredibly horrific business models for people to work within. And yet, for some people, that's the only choice they have. So, Steve, we know that, ironically, you're also fighting back. Christy's had a long-term campaign on a number of these companies, but the ITF's also been fighting back on companies like Uber, who also use the technology basically take fairly traditional work and deny an employment contract or a decent working environment. But tell us about the good news story of cracking, one, a legal settlement in the UK, but then an agreement in Belgium.
Thanks, Sharon. I think with all these issues, we go back to what's the role of the trade unions. So we know in the gig economy, the ITF is a strong campaigner to make sure all the gig workers are recognised as employees. But we started a conversation, again thanks to Sharon's introduction, with Uber about how do we deal with this situation. We are fighting Uber in the courts all around the world, and we won, or GMB won, a court case in the UK, arguing for the representation. But we also recognise for riders and drivers that occupational safety and health, issues around sanitation, particularly when I mentioned earlier the role of supply chain, well, the number of people using food delivery was skyrocketed through the pandemic. And the issues about, can I actually find a toilet during my break for a rider or a driver, a fundamental ability to take a comfort break. So Sharon, we worked on this process, and we had a very we used Zoom the right way to bring global people together, to have a conversation about where we disagree. So we've defined with Uber that we fundamentally disagree with their failing to recognise the employment of their workers, and we've agreed we'll continue to campaign against each other. But we did agree that there were areas where we could cooperate, and the cooperation is about union representation, rest time, vehicle safety, core issues that are critical to the riders and drivers of their cars. So in February this year, we signed a memorandum of understanding where we agreed the ITF would be the gatekeeper to relationships with unions. And the first success was here, just around the time that the government was changing. Our friends TWU, Transport Workers, here in Australia, signed an agreement with Uber to give them recognition and access for the workers here. That was the second big step. After GMB, over a year ago, got a recognition agreement and the right to go into their information hubs and organise the workers, collect their concerns, represent them to the company. So we have the UK now with representation. We also have Australia, and the latest good news story, Sharon, is one of our colleagues who's in the audience. Our friends in Belgium, the BTB, have been able to also sign a recognition agreement. Now, we haven't conceded the employment situation, but we have given unions the right to represent those workers, utterly critical. And we believe there'll be more countries coming along. So it isn't the answer to all the challenges, but for unionists. When we started speaking to Uber, they told us they had 5.3 million riders and drivers. 5.3 million. And in the ITF, we can't afford not to be in the conversation about how do we effectively represent those people. So it is a good news story, and we believe other companies in the gig economy will take note of that, and they'll have to move in the process. DoorDash here in Australia have signed a recognition agreement with TWU. So we feel, even though there's 4 transport names on our list, there is some good news in transport. There is some recognition that Labour can make a difference, and Uber have stood up and will be held accountable to deliver more unionised union workers in the riders and hail environment.
So unions fighting back, standing with workers, providing them with the support, the legal challenge where necessary, but trying to re-establish what is in fact a fundamental right for everybody, the dignity of an employment contract with rights at work, with just wages, and of course with health and safety. Christy, I want to ask you a particular question because I know that your campaigning leadership is legendary and you are tackling supply chain abuses. But I wanted to say, in the context of an organising strategy, how important is capital strategy? How important is it to use the investor leverage where you can to influence corporate behaviour to actually provide decent work?
I mean, for us, we put a lot of effort into capital strategies and building relationships with investors so that when we have evidence of some egregious wrongdoing, we can go to those investors. We're a credible partner in that regard, and we can get them to put pressure on companies. And I don't think let me say two things about it, because one thing is people think, oh, you just go to the investors and snap your fingers and then the problem is fixed. And far from it, it's usually a long dialogue, and we've started in some cases working with large groups of investors. So one case, we've got like anywhere between 40 and 60 investors that are sort of engaging with this company at any one time, which sounds like a lot, but that is actually, that's a good number, but that's what it takes to really get their attention. So it's not like a snap your finger kind of thing, and you really have to be able to talk about some systemic problems with a company, not just one incident, unless perhaps your incident would qualify. But I do think that, so on that regard, for us it's important, but I also want to stress that the other piece of it is that it's got to be really attached to real organizing on the ground. It's not like you read stuff in the newspaper and go to the investors. You've got to have a pipeline to workers who are putting their necks out, trying to organize, coming forward with problems, being brave, being willing to say, look at this incident, look at what happened, with this group of workers, photos, all the kinds of evidence that the investors would want to have, which can move them. You're talking about investors who might have 3,000 companies in their portfolio, or asset managers, and they want to know, why is your problem the one that we should put our time into? And so I think the burden is high enough that it's something you don't want to use every other day, and you absolutely don't go there with run-of-the-mill problems, or even like one case of union busting. But in the context of big companies in the supply chain, or if even not in the supply chain, even in among their own direct employees who really have decided to turn a blind eye to whatever happens when it's outside of their home base. When you're talking about those companies, the investors have an obligation. They have a due diligence obligation just the same as companies do. And increasingly, they're aware of the fact that they have an obligation to know what's happening in their portfolio companies. And if you bring it to their attention, they have an obligation to look at it. So for us, it's important. And again, I don't want to say it's the magic, the magic potion, but it is part of when you really want to think about the tools that are out there that can put pressure on companies to clean up their act. It's a really important one, together with the various kinds of legal tools and the various kinds of pressure on the ground and pressure from governments, pressure from clients. All these things are things that have to be considered. But I think investors, I'm finding that this year, and it's amazing how many more investors are coming out and saying, we need to be more mindful. We have 130 investors that signed on to an expectations agreement for nursing homes, for example, $4.5 trillion in assets. And it's very pro-union. It says, all these workers should have unions. They should have collective bargaining. Now, how do we translate that expectations document into real change? We haven't exactly figured out the best mechanism, because to 130, it's a lot. We have to mobilize them to act together, and we have to, have some good examples of companies that need to change. But I don't think we could have had 130 investors 5 years ago. I really think that this is a sea change. And what I see, investor engagement and teleperformance is really far beyond what we could have expected years ago. So I do see progress. We just have to make sure that it's not lip service, that it's real progress, that they're really willing to engage in a serious way. And that I think is on us to make sure it's not just, well, for purposes of ESG, we need to have this meeting. It's really not about that. It's about engaging with companies and driving change.
So this is, I mean, Christy talks about using all the tools in the toolbox, and I think we all know that if we don't have workers, if we haven't organised workers and their voices, if they're not invested in the campaign, then really there's not much point unions actually engaging in trying to bring a company to heel, because you're probably not going to be very successful. But on the other hand, we all know that organising strategies, it is about anger, hope, action, some very old principles, but if people are angry, if workers have an issue, then organising gives them hope, but hope alone won't actually change the environment. So you do need the action of different areas of leverage. So Steve, I know you've also invested, and indeed we have a global framework for engaging investors, because they should have the same legislative demands around an ESG lens, so environment, indeed social standards, and of course governance, so that they're not corrupt. But I want to deviate from that just a bit, because it is a very important tool, but it's one tool in the toolkit, as Christy says. What is, you know, in the end, why is it that governments have let our labour market be broken to this extent? Why have governments actually stood back and watched an economy that's so vulnerable that workers, 60% of them are informal? These businesses, these platform businesses, are informalising work beyond that. And you heard the Prime Minister of Australia this morning saying that you have to fight for fairness. Well, our message to governments around the world is they have to stand for fairness too. So, Steve, there's a lot of talk. There's a treaty in negotiation that your lawyers and our lawyers and Christie's and others are working on, a UN treaty on business and human rights, not just the rights, but the grievance procedures and the remedy. Germany's now got a bill on mandated due diligence. France has their vigilance laws. The EU's talking about a directive. How important in this frame of tools is legislation around mandated due diligence? Because I don't know about you two, but I've had a gutful of the lack of respect for workers, both from employers and from governments, who just sit back and think it's okay to allow companies to exploit workers, as if it's, you know, dehumanising exploitation in many of our supply chains. Really debased humanity is acceptable for what? For profits at any cost. So how important is legislation?
Thanks, Sharon. That's a great question. And to kind of come in behind Christy, the pillar of workers' capital is just one of the tools. But we're sitting here in Australia and in Melbourne, where it was the founding of the 8-hour day, which became legislation. So when we look at the history of all of our unions on a global level, we take action to translate it into law. And why do we translate it into law? To make the companies, the corporations, accountable. And then we can enforce it. And so for us, the legislation is critical. The work that's going on, and there's two prongs to this. Work in the European Union, we work very closely with Christy and her team in Uni, with DHL, because they've got new legislation. And Christy's 100% right. We need case studies. We need examples of the abuses to challenge these new legislations. But we need more legislation, and we need the work that's going on in the International Labour Organization to have a governance procedure for the global supply chain, the gig economy. We need those global standards that then convert into national standards. And then we need to organise on the ground. Couldn't agree more how critical it is that unions continue to organise and organise. And sometimes it's campaigning about signing up members who have grievances. Other times it's campaigning. I have to say, throughout the pandemic, on a number of levels, I was disappointed with the world's governments. We had to go all the way up to the United Nations Secretary General to say how disgusting it was that we couldn't get seafarers off ships because the ports were closed, the planes weren't flying. And Sharon and the whole of the Global Council of Unions constantly talked about how do we make sure that governments are accountable. Some of the governments don't even understand the global supply chain. Oh, guess what? We don't have any personal protection equipment. Let's fly people to China and bid. So, Sharon, law is critical. But there's also some other positives. And I should mention that after Michael O'Leary was made the worst boss 4 years ago, he did sign union recognition agreements all over Europe. It's critical that you're in a position to talk to the better companies who actually understand that the race to the bottom is unacceptable. And in the ITF and together with our other colleagues, we're looking at how do we make the clients of transport accountable for their supply chains. So governments need to be bold, and it was fantastic to hear from the Labour government this morning. It's critical that governments show leadership in this space. Has anyone noticed we have an economic crisis at the moment? And how do we power ourselves out of that? We give pay rises to the workers to help re-energise our economies. But that has to be based on justice, fairness and good law. So for us in the ITF, it's campaigning on the ground. We're still occasionally robust in our enforcement of standards, but we do believe we should have campaigns, and we do believe there should be better law. We need safety nets to protect our societies, and we're immensely proud to be part of a global movement that's talking about a social contract this week that sets a safety level for everyone. So we need good law and we need strong campaigns. Sorry, Sharon.
So, drum roll, who got the Worst Boss of the Year award? Well, Steve said after Michael O'Leary actually won it last time, he started to change his stripes. Now, I think the ITF, the Danish unions around the world probably had a bit to do with that, but nevertheless, Congress Live can claim some credit for being in the space. But this year, what do we want to happen out of this? Will Alan Joyce change his stripes? I must say I found it hard to get past Alan Joyce as the worst boss in the year. I just can't imagine you take such a great airline and you destroy its reputation almost overnight. Why? Because you don't care about the workers who actually make it strong. And then Amazon, well, we've had them on the pedestal before. And I did say to a forum Christy had a few weeks ago with the ITF and others that as much as Alan Joyce makes me annoyed as an Australian, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, would rather spend his money sending space junk, off the planet than actually doing something about the workers that, again, have built this model. So certainly I could argue that Amazon is an epic campaign by comparison. The Australians will take care of Qantas, but in fact, globally, we all have to take care of a model that is absolutely debasing a world of work for working people who just want to earn a decent living, look after their families, go home safe at night. But I do think, Steve, that the world rarely sees such a single act of, just scandalous behaviour from an employer who says, these workers, 800 of them, keep my company going, but guess what? I'd rather ground the company than treat the workers with dignity. So guess who gets the worst boss of the year? Hepplethwaite? Yes, down with Hepplethwaite. So Steve, what about that company now?
So there's a very strong message. We have a big delegation from our colleagues in the Arab world here. The ultimate owner of P&O Ferries now is DP World.
Whoa.
And we need the message to be sent all the way up. And we have looked at their capital strategies as well. It's not so easy to work out where their money's coming from. We do know.
I was about to say, we could take a good guess.
Yeah, so the reality is there's a very strong message. DP World, take some responsibility for P&O. Let's get back around the table. There's a really strong message to the British government that we need a sectorial agreement for the ferries that operate from the UK across the rest of Europe. Ireland, our friends in the Nordic countries, Belgium, France. We need a standard that represents all of them, because there are other companies in ferry trades that have good union collective agreements. So we talked about governments. There's a very strong message to the British government. Set some legislation set some minimum standards. Let's get round the table with all of the employers on those trades, and let's make sure we don't have to resort to good old-fashioned ITF tactics where ships get stopped, cargo gets delayed. Let's have a framework with all the employers in the sector, so hopefully you can follow Michael O'Leary, Mr. Hepplethwaite, and move forward in a way where you can have good industrial relationships that respects the working men and women on your ships. Because every time we have an incident like this, the people that were your customers have said they'll never go on your ferries again. And we know it's having an impact on your business. I won't be long, Sharon. We know also that the freight companies have not used them and are using the competition. So if you want to recover some of your market and you want to recover some of your credibility, let's get around the table and sort this out.
There you go, Mr. Hepplethwaite. Here's the challenge. Do you want to dilute that reputational risk of being the worst boss in the world? Then sit down and talk about how you change your stripes. It's possible. Let's see it done. Christy, I'm going to give you the last words because, you know, we know that in the end we have to tackle the multinational corporate abuses. But if there's one thing that you would say that you want to see happen from the union movement or across with the support of the union movement, of governments, what would make the difference to start to bring these multinationals to heel in terms of decent work in supply chains?
Well, Steve talked about laws, and we do need laws. I mean, there is no question that, the treaty that you talked about earlier, getting access to the courts of the peak company in the supply chain is part of the treaty that's under discussion. Having that would transform everything. Every company would be afraid to be sued when they're, every country would be more worried about what happens in Bangladesh and the factories if every factory worker could actually bring a lawsuit in whatever country those brands operated or their home base. So I think that in terms of a legal framework, that would really change the supply chain governance. That would be it. And then, it's just a question of, on the flip side, is for unions to not give up on organizing in the supply chain, because that's really what drives a lot of this change, is workers in motion. And by that I mean, where there is no collective bargaining at all, we have to use our efforts and our solidarity to support that process so that we are actually growing unions, even against obstacles. I understand there's obstacles. It's very hard to organize in many countries, but I do think that we have to couple both of those strategies. I think we need laws that hold companies accountable at wherever they're located, and that means to some extent you need national laws have to shift. That can be driven by trade laws. I mean, we see a whole range of options in order to get countries to change their national laws. But you need that global governance for sure, and that's going to be a big piece of it. So I don't know, Sharon. I know that's not an answer to your question because you said one thing, but I think we have to do more than one thing. I mean, I think we can never just rely on having the right laws in place unless we've got the right motion. Unless we've got the right motion on the ground, it won't matter what the laws are.
And the courts to hold them to account.
You've got to have the courts to hold them to account. We need better rules, there's no question about it. I think the due diligence rules in Europe have promise. I think the German one has maybe more promise than the French one, but we've seen with the French law that it's been disappointing, that, it's become, okay, we'll do our due diligence report and not more. So, there's a lot of elements that go into that to make it a useful tool that actually holds companies to account. But you do see progress. You do see companies, especially in Europe, and I would exclude the US by and large from that, but you do see European companies recognizing it is no longer okay for them to say, we don't know what's happening in Pakistan. We just know our local manager says everything's fine. They know they can't get away with that anymore, or we don't know what's going on in El Salvador, but the local manager, it's all fine, and we go by local rules, and so long as we apply local rules, we're fine. That, you don't hear that as much anymore. There is a shift, and that's important to recognize that. There is a shift, and we have to just keep pushing that when it comes to the supply chain. But it's not enough of a shift. It's too slow. We need to, have better tools, going back to that word.
Well, there you go. You've heard it right here on Congress Live. You need to organise. You need to use the leverage of investment against the companies based on reputational risk or indeed legal risk for the investors. And you need the laws to hold those corporations to account for the basic demands of the humanity of treating people with the fundamental rights they're entitled to, with a share of the prosperity based on decent minimum living wages and indeed, of course, collective bargaining rights. But we also need strong democracies and good governments. And this week, we've heard from Joe Biden, a US president, saying good union jobs build economies, and they're good for, indeed, workers and their families. You've heard Jacinda Allen talking about legislation that indeed is inclusive of allowing workers to feel like they have a fair share of the economy, a well-being economy. And today we had our very own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who I think if we just had maybe 20 of those, we could change the world. So fighting for democracy, good leaders, unions raising their voice, organising workers and demanding the laws, that's what it's all about. Our supply chains are places where men and women, our brothers and sisters, suffer dehumanising exploitation. We've walked them, we've talked to workers, we've documented it, and it has to end. So here you have it, worst boss in the world this time, Mr. Heppleswaite, but there could be 100 of these people, and we plan to actually tackle them until they're prepared, as Steve called for, to sit at the table and to enter social dialogue, collective bargaining agreements that are respected where workers matter. Thank you all very much. Thank you.